Kia ora and welcome to another episode of the Holistic Human Podcast. My name's Amanda and today I'm interviewing Rima Meadow. Gosh, we talk about a lot today. Rima is an American living in Switzerland. She is a very knowledgeable anthroposophist and today we talk about almost everything. The chat's kind of divided into three parts. So the first part is her as like a brief biography. We talk about her upbringing, her eurythmy training, and her anthroposophical speech training. Then we move on to discuss many anthroposophical topics, including Steiner's view on women and homosexuality. And spoiler alert, he saw women as equals and knew that as long as adults were in a consenting relationship, sexual preference was not an issue. Rima goes on to talk about the original Bible and what was really written, and none of it really condemned homosexuality and just really was warning people against power imbalances. Then we move on to the oral history project that Rima has undertaken, which is like a gigantic mission where Rima is talking to older anthroposophists and trying to collect a whole bunch of knowledge so that it doesn't die out. She has access to all kinds of amazing magical materials and resources and artwork, and she's just really passionate about making sure that people in the English-speaking world know it exists. So she shares some stories from that. Then we move on to two subjects that Steiner said were of the utmost importance for anthroposophists or any spiritual seeker to understand. Those being the folk souls, which is related to place, not race, and the occult political. So we kind of touch on the concept of hidden history. It starts to get pretty esoteric. We use the events of World War I and World War II to illustrate this concept. And then we kind of round it all up by discussing the threefold social order, and we kind of envision what could be. In my mind, I mean, a lot of us, I know, believe that if we can imagine it, we can create it. And I think there's a lot of potential right now for us to start creating new ways of being and living and just being on this earth and being human. So sometimes that means that we need to look at things that are uncomfortable and dark and transform them, and not get lost in what is difficult, but try and find that inner light and know that we have the power to be able to transform things for the good. All is not lost. There is a lot of hope. And if we can all connect with each other and learn from each other and really listen and understand, I think we can find that actually a brighter future is a possibility. So yeah, enjoy this chat we have today. It's quite long, so you might want to listen to it in a few parts or get your art supplies out and, do some creating while you're listening. You can find Rima at Anthroposophical Impulses on Instagram, and you can also find her Patreon page using that name as well, Anthroposophical Impulses. Links are in the show notes. And you can connect with me at the Holistic Human Aotearoa on Instagram. And I think that's the same name for me on YouTube and Facebook. And if you want to support this podcast, you can do so by going to my Buy Me a Coffee link and buying me a coffee or becoming a producer of the show. Or you can just flick me some coin on PayPal, and that just helps pay for my internet bill and the web hosting costs that podcasts cost. So yeah, enjoy the podcast. Let me know what you think and have a wonderful, beautiful week, and look for the joyful in the everyday. So welcome, Rima. I am really happy to welcome you to this episode of the Holistic Human Podcast. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today.
Of course.
Yeah. So we're going to go through this podcast in three sections. So we're going to go through your biography just so that people get an understanding of who you are, a little context. And people that have been following you on Instagram for a while, I think would be quite interested to hear some of your story. And then we're going to go into your work at the moment with the Oral History Project, which I'm excited to hear more about. And then that will just lead us into us talking about history and how there are some hidden aspects to it that people might want to be aware of. But we'll see how much time we have for that and what we decide to talk about. Cool. So, Rima, please introduce yourself. Where are you speaking from today?
That's another question.
Yeah, two questions in one.
My name is Rima Meadow, and I'm an American living in Switzerland. So I'm currently in the town of Gempen, which is near Dornach. And Dornach is, of course, the accidental world center of anthroposophy.
Yeah. Cool. So you're speaking to us from Switzerland and you're an American. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about, you know, how you got there. What was your upbringing? What was your upbringing like? Can you tell us a bit about the town you grew up in or your family life, maybe your schooling?
Yeah. So I was raised by two people who were thoroughly alternative, we'll say, for Americans. My mother found anthroposophy. They got together and moved from Tulsa, Oklahoma to a little town in Arkansas called Eureka Springs. And my dad was a chiropractor, and my mother found anthroposophy while she was pregnant with me because there was a little study group thinking about starting a Waldorf school there. And that didn't happen. It became another alternative school, but my mother found anthroposophy and she never let it go. And my father was not happy about anthroposophy. He was very anti-Christian, and he, read a few things about anthroposophy early on. He didn't start with the basic books. He started with something else and just said, this is wrong, and left it. And so that sort of had a karmic results for the rest of my life. But he was oddly open to it when it was actually present. Like, I don't know how to say that. He was politically aware. He knew what was happening politically. And he was very aware in the health areas because he was in alternative medicine. He had a deep distrust for regular medicine. And when he visited the eurythmy school where I went, he was very open to what was there. So my mother became a Waldorf teacher later, but for the first 11 years of my life, she studied alone and worked on anthroposophy alone and did her best to create a Waldorf childhood without any sort of outer help other than books. I remember her like trying to make dolls and not having a clue how to do it and things like that. We lived on a little farm, and that was very beautiful, in the Ozark Mountains, which are these curvy hills with a lot of water. And then we were near a town that was an artist colony. So it was a place where everyone could afford to own their own house. It was cheap. All the houses were little old Victorians because it had been a spa, a place with a lot of springs, and people had come from Chicago and built houses in the late 1800s. Beautiful place, like for America, like gorgeous architecture. And everyone that I knew was either renovating an old house, gutting it down to the bones and trying to build it back up to be original. They weren't, they were actually faithful to it. I was surrounded by adults who were consciously creative. And there were people who were doing woodworking and people who were like good oil painters and the best potter I've ever seen. And those are just some examples. The entire town was full of artists. they were all, they bought their 40 or 80 acres and they were building their house in the winter and waitressing in the summer, and they could make that work because it was cheap.
Mm.
And so that's like an ideal that I've always had of like people can follow their own destinies and they can make it work financially, but it doesn't work in a speculative housing market.
No way.
And I've watched that happen in New Zealand because I was in New Zealand when I was 16 and when I was 28. So I know it happened to you and I know when it happened to you all, but it's like it's happening everywhere in the world. It's happening in England now. Things are totally out of reach. So even the corners where it used to be cheap are getting flooded with yuppies. And then you no longer have this, like, if you're a farmer or an artist and you want to just start something, you need to have a barn and some land.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have this basis that you're not spending all your time in the rat race.
Totally. And I mean, New Zealand, we've got the issue with people internationally who buy property here and don't even live here. So there are people that own like 30, 40 properties, don't live in New Zealand, but use it as a tax haven income, money earning thing.
Yeah, and it's something that's happened for the most part. I'm 43 and it's happened during my lifetime and in many places in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And New Zealand's, of course, can be very specifically dated to Peter Jackson's films. That is what made everyone aware of how beautiful New Zealand was. And that is when you had people coming in and driving up the housing market. But yeah.
So it would have been quite nice to actually see how it worked before the world shifted, and it's become quite, I wonder if there are any pockets in the world where you could do that now.
It's shifted a lot in the last year too, because people with money are leaving the cities. So those pockets are now being bought up as well because of that.
Yeah. So when you obviously grew up and you moved on, so where did you go to after, when it was time for you to leave school and branch out into the world on your own?
There's a middle step. My mother and I moved to California when I was 11. I went to Waldorf school, and I'm grateful for going to Waldorf High School because I think American high school experiences can be quite traumatic. So I would not in any way say that the high school I went to was perfect. I had a lot of thoughts even when I was there about how it could be better.
Yeah, right.
But I was not bullied, and I'm grateful for that. And my mother did a training, and I mentioned that high school experience because that was what gave me an introduction to the eurythmy school that I went to, which is in California.
Right.
And so I ended up going to college for a few years, but I learned a few decent things, but for the most part, it was an introduction in how that was not what I wanted.
As in the what you were studying was not what you wanted, or like that pathway of university to work?
I think I was always a truth seeker, and there was no truth. There was postmodernism. There was everyone has their own truth. There is no universal truth.
Oh, because you were studying philosophy.
No, I was just in college, and that was the baseline.
Oh, yeah,
and,
true, Danny.
Like, I think even a regular, rigorous academic, like old-fashioned academic training, I could have probably handled.
Right.
But it just depressed me to such a degree that there was no truth.
Yeah. I can see why that would be depressing.
Yeah, it leaves you alone. It leaves you with, like, the only thing that you have left to seek is your own pleasure. And that's not really enough for me. I'm not sure it's enough for any human being.
No. Yeah. So what were you studying?
I just did whatever I could not to go insane. So, quite literally. So I never meant to be a studio artist, but I ended up doing studio art because I couldn't be doing all the academic classes. It was just too dry.
Oh, yeah, fair enough.
So I did studio art and I did lighting design. And the lighting design, theatrical lighting design, I'm grateful for. That's been useful.
And so did you Did you go into like full-time work after that, or was there an epiphany where you were like, oh, I want to be a eurythmist?
I didn't want to be a eurythmist ever. When I was 18, I wanted to go to eurythmy school, but
why is
I
that?
well, I'm not sure it's that important. It's not really my destiny. It's a training I'm very grateful for. But movement was never my talent, and if I had picked a performing art, which I did when I was 5 years old, it would have been acting.
Interesting.
So there was in America, there are 2 eurythmy schools. So eurythmy is relatively well represented in America.
But before we get into that, is it possible for people who might not be sure, who are listening to this, they might actually not know what eurythmy is? Is there a way to describe, how would you describe that to somebody who hasn't come across it before?
That would be specific to every person I talk to, but it's Steiner called it yoga for the West.
Yoga for the West. Yes.
There are gestures for all of the sounds. There are 2 areas of eurythmy. There's speech eurythmy and there's tone eurythmy. So they're gestures for music. And when you watch a music piece, my impression is my gifts are not in the area of music. But when I watch a piece in good eurythmy done on stage and a music piece, I can understand it better. I get more out of it if I see it in eurythmy than if I just listen to it.
Yeah, for sure.
And with speech, you're kind of painting pictures of the meaning of the poem with these gestures of the sounds, which are very flexible. You can do them in lots of different ways. And I'm a pedagogical eurythmist. I taught children for 10 years. And I would have and did give very different answers to children when they asked me, why are we doing eurythmy? It really depends on the audience, what answer I give about that.
Yeah, cool. Good to just have like a little general explanation. And there's lots of videos people can look at online, and I'm sure there's lots of eurythmy websites that people could go to find out more. But thank you for that. So sorry for interrupting you, but you were saying there are 2 different eurythmy schools in America?
There are, and speech, Steiner's baseline, which your listeners probably already know, is that Steiner refounded everything. So eurythmy is actually a totally new thing. And it's much more about an inner movement than an outer movement, which is why I would actually recommend not looking at videos of eurythmy, finding a eurythmist and talking to them, or trying to take a class or reading about it. But it's very much about a eurythmy training. You could learn all the gestures in 1 year, but to learn to, when you make the gesture for reverence, or when you make the gesture for awe, the sound awe, that you actually are feeling that particular movement inside. That takes a lot longer than a 4-year training. That takes a lot of time. Anyway, the thing that I was interested in was speech and drama, which is a sister art to eurythmy.
Yeah.
Steiner founded, and there are 4-year trainings in different places, but it lives actually the most strongly in Australia. Australia and New Zealand have more speech than probably anywhere else in the English-speaking world. And that is an art of recitation, like you recite a lot of poetry, but you're making a relationship to sounds, and that the drama would be based on the speech. But there's a lot to say about that, but that's the training that I came to Switzerland to do.
Right.
Because it wasn't very available in America.
And then you did that training, and then you came over to New Zealand, or you?
I went from college to Germany, where I spent 6 months, and it was in Germany that I decided I wasn't going back to college, so I didn't actually finish that degree. I went to eurythmy school. I finished a 4-year eurythmy training when I was 25, and from then on I was teaching. And during that time when I was teaching, I taught in Scotland and I taught in New Zealand. And when I was 32, I'm sorry, it's morning here, so just morning voice. When I was 32, I decided that I really did want to pursue speech. And that was the first time I came to Switzerland, because I was aware that there was a master speech artist in who's actually a New Zealander, Sophia Walsh, who lives in Dornoch.
Interesting.
And I came here to work with her. And I've worked with Peter Bridgemont in England and Don Langman in Australia. And I've worked with a number of people that would be well known to German-speaking audience, but not to an English-speaking one. So people who had worked on the Gratianum stage, I've worked with. Yeah.
That's so cool. Well, I do have a question about your teaching experiences that you might have some insight or anything that you think people would benefit from. But you gave me a tip about drinking raw eggnog in terms of like building my resilience when teaching, my own teaching. And it's worked so well because I used to go every time I would teach, I'd start to get a migraine, like every time. And since I've done that, I haven't had one migraine and I haven't had to use ibuprofen or anything.
Huh.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I had no idea it was a migraine cure. No, that's an indication from Steiner. Again, a lot of things from Steiner, you get them and you're like, this is weird, or this seems totally impractical, or this seems kind of woo-woo, but they actually turn out to be really, really practical things. So Steiner recommended that eurythmists in specific drink lots of milk and cream. And he recommended that for stage eurythmists and teaching, I assume.
Yeah.
And the relation here is that the eurythmy draws on the etheric body. It draws on your life forces, the body that you share with the plants. The other things that draw on that are teaching young children and being a mother. So children up until the age of 7, I think they're like, I don't remember the exact terminology, but they're like living in your etheric body, drawing on your etheric forces. It's like they're still in an egg. They're in this egg of your life forces.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that recommendation, which is for eurythmists and teaching any age of children, they're going to draw on your life forces, I think is also important for young mothers and for those who are teaching children, possibly even up to the age of 14, actually.
Yeah, well, I teach class 6 and 7, so they're 11, 12, 13-year-olds, so it works fine.
So the practical physical aspect of that is that they used to talk about how every time you were pregnant, you would lose a tooth.
Yeah.
I'm not a scientist, but somehow the etheric is bound up with that, that you draw minerals out of your own body to make the body for a baby.
Yeah.
And I found that my teeth were going bad from teaching eurythmy. If you get the cookbook Nourishing Traditions and you read about raw milk, and they have a raw eggnog recipe in there. And that's where I got that. And when raw milk wasn't enough, then I would make eggnog, and that helped.
Yeah, that's so good. I think lots of little things like that are really helpful for people that are teaching or have young children. Or I think it's, for me personally, when I've just got very, it's like raw nerves almost. It's like my nerve endings are just so sensitive. Things can be it's almost quite painful, like noise or lots of people. And it's things like these, I think raw eggnog and that vitamin D and fish oils and stuff, they just add like an extra coating. It feels like that. They're adding like an extra coating to your nerves and also your, like you say, building up the minerals and stuff. I wish teachers had more access to these kinds of tips.
Vitamin D is an important thing. If you're having tooth trouble at all, get some good organic vitamin D and just take a lot of it.
Yeah.
It helps. There is an Instagram account, Dr. Stephen Lin, where he talks about the relation of tooth health to the rest of the body, and it's very informative. So he's, I don't think, an anthroposophist, but again, the Nourishing Traditions book is based on Weston Price. There's also an Instagram account there. And Sally Fallon, who wrote that book, is not an anthroposophist, but she works strongly with Tom Cowan, who is an anthroposophical doctor. So there's a relation there, and she does mention Rudolf Steiner a couple of times in that cookbook. But again, that's a great source. It's not a Bible for me.
Yeah, right.
I think I take the things that I can do out of it and do them. I think with everything, it's okay to pick and choose.
Yep, for sure. You've got to take things that work for you and leave things that don't, because we're all individuals, right? We're all here with a different mission, so we all need different tools to achieve our missions. So you discussed how your mother built a relationship with this when you were a child, and you went to a Waldorf school and obviously went and did the eurythmy and speech training. But was there any turning point for you where you felt like, oh, this is the practice that I want to commit myself to? Because there's a lot of practices out there that people can choose from.
I'm going to say something that hopefully will not come across as too dogmatic. I was raised among hippies, and everyone in that town had their own spiritual path. And as a child, I could feel what felt a little bit wonky and what didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were certain people that I just loved and always wanted to be around. And one of them is a Buddhist, one of them, still a friend to this day, one of my godmothers. And there are various people where it was like, you could feel like they were really on the right path for them. And then there was my mother and my godmother who were in anthroposophy. And I don't think I really thought about it, but what my mother really did for me, which is a great gift, I've seen many anthroposophical children run the other direction because their parents have forced it down their throats. My mother never forced it down my throat. Like, she did it. She was an example of it, but she didn't really talk about it to me so much. And I always just saw the books, like occult science and things, sitting on her shelf. And I always sort of had this feeling, I'll read those someday. But it was never conscious, right? It was never like, I'm going to be an anthroposophist. And then I met the teachers at the eurythmy school, and I had questions because my parents had been married lots of times. I had a question about true love. I had certain questions about life, about destiny and life. And they were the first adults that I met who were absolutely consciously standing in life and saying, yes, true love exists. Yes, you have a destiny and you can find it. And at 18, I was like, I'm going to that school. And my mother was like, you never wanted to be a eurythmist. I'm like, doesn't matter. I'm going to that school.
Yeah.
And because I wanted that people who had walked the path and hadn't compromised.
And then that was just that clicking point, was it?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get back there until I was 21, but it was very much like, and then when I got there, it was like, oh, this is hard. I mean, you step into anthroposophy and it's not easy.
No.
It's working on yourself. It's difficult. And doing an artistic training in anthroposophy will take you through your blockages and your traumas and stuff. You will have to work through those or start with. And there was definitely at the beginning, it was like, I think my main thing was, if I start this path, I don't get to quit. It's going to keep going through this life and the next one is like,
yeah.
It was a big decision.
Yeah.
Now it's different because it's like I let myself breathe and I realize that I'm a snail. I'm not a gazelle. Human development takes time.
Yeah.
And it's, so I'm not under as much pressure. And basically, the older I get, the more I'm just like, I'm super grateful for Rudolf Steiner. He never lets me down.
In what way do you mean that?
He doesn't. I mean, it's like we've been discussing this question of racism and, various things. If you really go and you read the things and they aren't taken out of context, or this little bit has been translated into English and you don't have the rest of the lecture or whatever.
Yeah.
If you really go and read, I mean, I think where Steiner helped me the most is there's been lots of areas, but I think one thing that I ended up having to wrestle with was the question of homosexuality. And I went to him and he was and the quotes about it are not well known that he made, but they do exist. And they were just like for 1920, or really for even now, just like he there's something that Judith von Hollis says about Christ. She says that there were a lot of female apostles that we don't hear about. And she says we get deceived that he was in a relationship with Mary Magdalene. She's like, that was not she's like, he wasn't. First of all, he was so developed that he could be celibate without that being an issue. But the thing he was trying to do with Mary Magdalene was establish that he could take a female esoteric student and that they could do the same esoteric work as men.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And he established that 2,000 years ago, and we're still trying to catch up to it. So Christ, you can look at him and you can say he basically didn't make mistakes.
Yeah.
Steiner is a human being, not a god incarnate. So he did make some mistakes, but mostly he's trying to establish certain things. And he even did that thing. Like the first Vorstand of the Anthroposophical Society was 3 women and 2 men.
That's pretty revolutionary for the time, right?
Yeah. And he also said women are going to save spirituality. I mean, some of his very best co-workers, Edith Marion, who he treasured. I'm sorry, sometimes the German word wants to come, and that's no use here. He thought
we'll use it though.
Der hochgeschätzt hat. He treasured Edith Marion, and of course a woman. He would have had her in the Vorstand, but she died early. Right. Ida Wegmann, who again, there was a whole conflict between Marie Steiner and Ida Wegmann, but Ida Wegmann did incredible work working with medicine, but also with founding an entire school for special needs children. And she also rescued Jewish children later after Steiner had died when the Nazi thing came into Germany.
She rescued children?
Yeah, she was in Switzerland. So he did this thing where there were South American countries that would take the Jewish family, but did not want to take a family that had a handicapped child.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Well, because it would have been a weight on the system. And yeah. And so she would take this disabled child into Switzerland. So she was saving the lives of these children, but also the entire family who could then emigrate.
Wow. So is this kind of where the Camp Hill Hohepa movement started from, kind of? Or was it just parallel?
It's not parallel, it's first.
Yeah, right.
I find it a little sad that most people who know of Camp Hill do not realize that Steiner, during his life, he didn't, as with everything, he didn't personally start the thing. Somebody came to him with a question and he helped them. There were 2 schools. There was a school in Germany, started right after the First World War, and there was a school here that was started by Ida Wegmann. So there were 2 that were founded while Steiner was alive with his advice. He was over there it's like a 20-minute walk from the Goetheanum. So he was in Arlesheim at the hospital and at this school all the time. They could ask him questions all the time.
Was this different from the Waldorf school?
Yes. Yeah.
I didn't realize.
Waldorf school was in Stuttgart. Oh yeah, this is a special needs school. It's called the Zon.
It's called the what, sorry?
The Sonnenhof, the sun farm, kind of. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool.
And so all of that work, Karl Koenig was at that school, I think after Steiner died, and learned from them, and then took that into the Camp Hills. But I've worked at the Sonnenhof, and people are well paid there. And I don't want to throw anything at the Camp Hills. They're working in a different situation, but I find that the Waldorf movement tends to be exploitative with the reality of pay in the English-speaking world.
Is it expecting people to work for less or volunteer, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the Camp Hills are volunteer.
Yeah.
And the Sonnenhof is not. That's just one thing. But it would be something that if people are really interested in that movement and in special needs care, they could do some research into these first schools as well as into the Camp Hill movement. There may be some differences there.
Oh, that's so interesting. It'd be awesome. I've looked for stuff for quotes or lectures from Steiner where he's talked about homosexuality or just queerness in general, because I always had a feeling he would have been really accepting of that. But I've never found anything. So if you have some quotes or anything, even if you send me not right now, but at a later date, I'd love to read it.
So there are three things. There is the quote that everybody knows, or you may not have heard it, but it's there and everyone knows about it. That quote is that people have, if you're a woman, you have a female physical body and you have a male etheric body. And that's where Steiner says, like, a woman's feeling is like a lion. He's like, the women are so much stronger in their feelings. So the men would have a male physical body and a female etheric body. That's everybody. So that thing where men, where women will often like be able to recognize their soulmate, and men take a long time to come to it. They're not as strong in their feeling life.
Right.
That thing where we talk about feminists talk about male fragility and stuff, but it's a thing, it's real. That's why it's there. That's why, it's because women are stronger in the feeling life. Anyway, gay people don't have the opposite. So a homosexual man would have a male physical body and a male etheric body, and a woman vice versa. So that's the quote, right?
Okay.
What that does is it establishes that gay people exist and they cannot be converted because that is their constitution.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that Steiner he said that, and most anthroposophists can come across that or know that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are a couple of other things. There's like the question, are gay people immoral? Is it immoral to live like that? Then I had to dig, because there are certain lectures that were given to certain groups of people and to this day are not public.
Yeah, right.
And the answer to that question was in the lectures to the Christian community priests. So the priest group, there were few women, I think it was mostly men, and they all were at like some farm in southern Germany, sleeping in the hayloft together and swimming in the pond. And they were working together for 2-3 weeks before they came to Dornach to ask Steiner all of their questions. During that time, there was a gay man there too, in that group. And for some reason, he then didn't come to Dornach. Who knows? I don't know his name. I just know that he didn't come, but the priests had been spending time with him and he had been there and was supposed to be part of their movement. And so they had this question uppermost in their mind. And somebody said to Steiner, so what about gay people? And Steiner said, well, as long as they don't have other moral hindrances, there's no reason they can't be a priest.
Yeah, just like even heterosexual people, as long as they're not
anybody who has the moral standing to do that work.
Yeah,
doesn't matter if they're gay.
Yeah, awesome.
And yeah, so that's great. That clears up the question of destiny.
Yeah.
But the other beautiful thing that comes out of that is Emil Molt. Emil Molt is the Waldorf school. Emil Bock. Emil Bock. There are a lot of his books translated. The 3 years. There's a whole series of his Bible studies that are translated into English. So he's easy to find. But the other thing is that Christian community priests do their own translation of the New Testament.
Oh, is that part of their work, their training?
As part of their work, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Because Steiner had said, and that you can find in numerous of his lectures about Christianity, that the translation is only at the level of initiation of the translator, not of the writer. So if you translate the Revelation of St. John and you are not as developed as St. John was, that's what you're going to get. That's what everyone's going to be reading. And the Bible is an esoteric book. And that becomes important because of all the Bible quotes about homosexuality. I went because somebody threw that in my face, the Bible thing. And I went and I read Emil Bock's New Testament translation, which unfortunately is not into English, it's into German, but I can read German. So I read his New Testament translation. I went and looked up all the places where supposedly the New Testament talks about homosexuality, and it is not in there. There is a point where St. Paul's the one who mainly is supposed to be saying bad things about gay people.
Yeah.
And what he says, the one area where that is, he says, it's better if everyone can be celibate. He says, that's for spiritual development. It's a really good idea if you can be celibate. If you can't be celibate, you need to find a partner and get married so you have a place to put those sexual desires. That's what St. Paul says.
Yeah, right.
There's nothing in there about homosexuality.
Where did all the homosexuality stuff come from? Are you saying that the person that translated it was like their own stuff that they put in there? Yeah, right.
Yes. And I'm also saying that the Old Testament stuff, the Leviticus quotes, a man may not lie with a man, that stuff is mistranslated too.
From the original Greek?
From the original Hebrew.
Hebrew.
Right. Old Testament is Hebrew. So that is also important because what that quote actually says is a man may not lie with a boy.
Because obviously.
Right.
Children are not for that.
And it also says Jewish people may not go to centers of ritual prostitution, which existed. I mean, there were some in ancient Greece. I haven't fully penetrated that, thought through it. Like, was that ever appropriate or not? Was that a fallen form even in ancient Greece? I don't know.
It's another thing.
It's a whole other question. But this people, who was the chosen people, they are not allowed to do that.
Yeah, right. But that's not specific to like if a man loves a man and they want to be in a relationship together. That's like a completely different issue. Or it's not even an issue, it's a completely different situation.
And the other quote, of course, is the Sodom and Gomorrah quote, which is actually about rape.
Yeah, which again, don't do that.
Right. So what the Old Testament or the Bible in general has established is that the sexual sphere is an area where you do not use coercion. The sexual is a place where the spiritual can come into the earth without work. Like, the spiritual forces are still flowing through you. You love this person, you want to be with them physically. And so it is a spiritual sphere. And so if you are coercing someone, if there's power involved, if there's manipulation involved, and there's always power involved if it's an adult and a child.
Oh yeah.
If you're paying someone for it, or if you're raping someone. So those things the Bible says are not okay. Yeah. And of course that leads directly into, of course, those things also create huge amounts of trauma in a person.
Yeah.
Being abused or being raped, or I can't speak to the prostitution thing because I don't know enough about it. But if you get into the power dynamic in the sexual, you're creating trauma.
Totally. I think for there are lots of sex workers that do work, and I've known them that are that have ways of managing that, and actually they're fine with it. Do you know what I mean? But there are lots of people in that industry that it's not well managed and it can be very manipulated. Like in New Zealand, prostitution is decriminalized. It's not legal, but it's decriminalized, so you can monitor it. Do you know what I mean? And keep people safe. Whereas back in the days, they probably didn't have unions and health and safety regulations and ways to keep themselves safe. So I totally hear that. Thanks for sharing that. That's really interesting. So I don't think it gets talked about enough. Anyway, continue. Sorry, I interrupted you.
The thing that's important, though, to realize is that not all Christian churches, but if you look at the Catholic Church, and that would, again, everything has nuance. I am not saying the Catholic Church is bad. I'm saying, or that there are lots of lovely people involved in that religion, but I'm saying that what the certain rules that have been made about celibacy, right? I'm sure that there are a number of priests who are not actually spiritually ready to be celibate.
Yeah.
So then that's what St. Paul is actually saying, is that you should allow them to be married. Or he was saying that for everybody. But, and again, the Catholic Church has a huge pedophilia problem.
Yeah, totally.
But they outlaw homosexuality.
Mm.
So this mistranslation has led to a lot of evil, actually. And homosexuals, if you have consenting relationship between two adults who love each other, that actually shouldn't be an issue. It isn't an issue in the original Bible.
No.
It isn't an issue for Steiner.
No.
And so Steiner, the other quote, and I'm going to send you to the direct source.
Cool.
There is a podcast where Dawn Langman, I think it's called Being Human, maybe, or something. There's a podcast that with Dawn Langman, who's in Australia, and she knew the person who read this lecture, but again, the lecture is hidden. We can't find it.
What?
It's possible that people know about it and they're hiding it from us. I know that sounds weird, but again, it's been very difficult nobody can get their hands on it. But Steiner gave a lecture about homosexuality, and my best guess is that he gave it to doctors.
Right.
And in that lecture, he talks about homosexuality in ancient Greece, and he talks about why people are homosexual. And he also says that if you're going to have a homosexual relationship, and he's talking in a time when there's no in vitro fertilization and probably you couldn't adopt. And he's saying two people that are together should have an objective outside goal in order to keep the relationship healthy.
Oh, because they couldn't have children.
Right. And apparently he said that for straight people too. But that establishes that, yes, you can have your true love and you can, live with that person, and this is not an issue.
No. And any relationship probably isn't healthy if it's just focused on children too, by the way. You've got to have other things that you have in common aside from. So yes, that's probably a good goal to have for everybody.
But that talk or conversation with Dawn has much better information about that lecture than I could ever give, because
cool.
It's like third or fourth hand.
Well, thank you for going off on that tangent.
Yeah, sure.
I really appreciate it. You know so much stuff that most of us don't have access to. And so that kind of leads us into what this oral history project is and why you started it.
Absolutely. Let's do that.
So what is the oral history project?
So the reality is that I was working actively in anthroposophy in America and other parts of the English-speaking world for about 10 years before I came to Dorna. I was teaching children. I was in every school where I was running study groups. I was even better trained in anthroposophy than most of the Waldorf teachers, even though they were a lot older than I was generally, because I had a 4-year training, and most of the teacher trainings in America are 2-year, or they are part-time, or anyway.
Yeah.
I knew more. And so I'd been, fighting this particular fight for a long time.
Yeah.
And when I came here and I had a lot of impressions. I had this impression of like, God, there's so much money and they're not, they're not doing the things they're doing with it are not the things I would choose.
Yeah, right. Money. Do you mean the Anthroposophical Society, or do you mean in Switzerland in general?
In the society, both.
Oh, right. Yeah, there's a lot of money over there.
Yes. Yeah. For in comparison to Switzerland, every country in the world is a third world country.
Yeah, right.
So Swiss people will set out beautiful furniture and prints and stuff on the street, and you can just take them.
What?
And yeah, just or they'll put them in the. That's the better option. Sometimes they'll just put them in the trash.
Oh my
anyway,
God.
And there's a certain amount of that in Dornach of like pouring money into something, and you're like, good Lord, I could have built a hospital, an anthroposophical hospital in America for the price that you just put into that.
Wow.
Anyway, it's that kind of a thing, and but it's also like I'd been an anthroposophist for 10 years or 12 even, and I'd never heard of anthroposophical jewelry.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that until I started following your page.
Right. Or there's honey salt bread. There's the whole bread story, which I would love to tell you.
Yes, please.
And and there were a number. Well, it wasn't just a number of things. I'm going to detail a few in
Yeah.
this talk, but there were like so many things that I'd never heard of, and it was very much like some of them are thriving and some of them are dying out. And people here are like, or there will be like prints and people are like, we just can't sell these. Nobody wants them. I'm like, nobody knows they exist.
Yeah.
You haven't advertised to the English speaking world or the Chinese speaking world or in, all of these places where anthroposophy is growing. You haven't advertised there, and now you're throwing them in the dumpster.
Send them to me.
I know. It's so it's this over and over again of like, we need to make a bridge. We need to make a bridge to the English speaking world, and these things need to come out into the world. And books that are written in German, if they have a lot of nice pictures, it doesn't matter that they're written in German. Somebody can have the pictures. It's just anyway. So a lot of frustration is what led to the Instagram account.
Yeah, right.
And then through that, I made friends. And one of the friends was a lovely lady in Australia. And we were having a talk one time on Skype, and we came to the idea of the Oral History Project, which is something that I should have come to myself earlier. But it takes work as a woman to become aware of and value your own impulses and destiny.
Yeah.
And so with the encouragement from Jill, it was like, oh yeah, I always want to hear the stories that all these old people have to tell. I'm going to go do that.
Yay.
And so that's what I'm doing. And some of it, though, is very much like, okay, well, if people in America or people in New Zealand or Australia or wherever knew about this stuff, they would be coming over to study with these old people and learn these things and carry them on into the world. Not. And these things are dying out with the people. So it's like to make a seed of something because they're not able to pass it on to anyone. And that's tragic. We don't want any of the impulses that Steiner found it to die. So it's that. It's all of that.
Right.
Like make more awareness, a bit of like make a little bit of a seed so people don't have to reinvent the wheel, that.
Yeah, for sure. So we're talking about your podcast that you have available for people who subscribe to your Patreon page. That's how it's run, isn't it?
Right. The Patreon is basically just sort of a little gift back to the people who want to support the project. What the Patreon is little distilled talks of mine about things I'm learning in that project. There's a bit of also the travel that I've done because that's another aspect oh my God, I love humanities, right? So I've always wanted to know about the Templars or Joan of Arc or, Neolithic monuments from an anthroposophical perspective.
Yeah.
And none of that exists in English, but it's all been done in German. Those people, there's a series on ancient monuments, although there's Egypt and there's Greece and there's, Stonehenge, all the stuff that's in England. Those books have been written by an anthroposophist. That one, his name is Frank Teichmann. But, it's like I have 16 boxes of books in the attic because this stuff, it's in German, it's happened. It's 100 years of work that's been done, but it's not getting translated in English. Talks are me talking about my travels in this country or that country and studies of folk souls and things like that too.
So is the Oral History Project not just the podcast? Are you creating something else?
The Oral History Project is hours and hours of conversations with old anthroposophists. It's hours.
Oh, wow. For some reason, I had the impression that it was just the podcast that you were doing.
No.
You're doing, right. So you're doing that. And what are you going to do with the recordings? Are you going to write it into a book or?
Yes, that's the hope. I'm meeting with 2 or 3 people a week. And I've, funding, if I could get funding, this is like 3 or 4 more years of work.
Yeah, for sure.
I could do another 1.5 years of interviews if I can get a visa to stay. And then it's years of me transcribing the interviews and then translating them into English.
Yeah.
And then the end hope is an online archive where all of the transcripts are available for free to anyone who wants to look at them.
Uh-huh. I see.
but
Wow.
also a book
Wow.
with extracts of like, this is my friend Anna Marie who makes jewelry, and this is what she's told me about jewelry, and this is, but a book that has little short articles about different things that also give you an introduction into these different impulses that nobody knows about.
Oh, that'd be amazing. Hopefully there's somebody really wealthy listening to this. Will be like, oh, I've been wondering what to do with all my money. I'll give it to Rima. Oh, wow. What a big project. I've always thought that it's been valid for you to have the podcast through Patreon, because I think people should be paid for the work that they do, so that's cool. But to know that there's like even more.
Yeah, it was just a way for people to donate to the project, really.
Yeah.
But I'm also happy to share, the knowledge that I've gained if people want to listen to it,
Yeah, for sure. So what kind of topics have you covered so far?
Are we talking about topics that are already on the Patreon, or topics that are other topics?
Up to you. Whatever you want to talk about.
If people go to the Patreon, they can hear about Victor Ullmann, who there are various things on there, but one of them that came out of a conversation that I had with someone was Victor Ullmann, who was a Jewish anthroposophist, probably from a converted family. Most of the people converted because it made things easier for them. So a lot of the people that the Nazis killed were not even practicing Jews.
They were just ethnically Jewish, you mean?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you say he converted, he converted.
I think his parents even converted to Christianity.
Right, I see what you mean.
But that's the German Jewish population was the most integrated Jewish population in the world. Felix Mendelssohn, that everyone knows, was Jewish, but I think had converted. They were the flower of German intellectualism and artists. Anyway, Ullmann was one of these very tragic stories where he was a gifted composer. He had worked with Arnold Schoenberg. He was a composer and musician, and he was writing beautiful things. He wasn't writing 12-tone music. He was writing his own thing. He sort of went off and did his own thing, but he was, I believe, Austrian, but also lived in Prague. He wrote operas, and one of them is an opera based on a play by Albert Steffen called The Fall of the Antichrist.
Oh.
And he also wrote a one called The Caesar of Atlantis, which is about, anyway, if people want to hear it, they can listen to the podcast. Point being that he died in Auschwitz.
Oh.
And he spent several years writing in Theresienstadt, which is another concentration camp. He wrote lots of things there and directed, orchestras and things. But that was one thing I discovered, that he's an important thing that people should know about. They should know about his work because it's easily available on YouTube. You can go listen to the things. There's so much. I think the thing that I wanted to focus on is anthroposophical jewelry, which is again, dying out because the school closed. There was one school here in Switzerland. It closed 10 years ago. So there's nobody being trained. There's a few people still working in the field in a few different countries over here. And there's one young person who is working in America. His name is Miles Ryan, and he has a website. So if you want to order jewelry or the planetary seals in hammered handmade metal, or the mystery drama seals in handmade metal, he can do those for you.
Oh, wow, cool.
He does want work. I don't know if there's anyone down under. I don't know if there's anyone in New Zealand or Australia. But this is a thing that if more people order jewelry or make the effort to get this and then wear it, it maybe doesn't have to die. And the jewelry impulse is very much about a therapeutic impulse. So wearing gold or silver is therapeutic. The stones, when Steiner was alive, he was helping a person pick the particular stone that would help that person be more themselves. And then design around that stone a particular form. There's a book on jewelry, Kleinodienkunst als göttliche Formensprache.
Wow.
which you will have heard that the last words, that Goetheanistic
Yeah.
form language. And and in that are his drawings. There's the piece photographed, and there's also his drawings and the back and forth conversation between him and the woman named Bertha Meyer Jacobs, who was making jewelry, the first anthroposophical goldsmith. And they're beautiful things, and they're supposed to help you be more yourself. And of course, tourmaline is the one that everyone can wear. It's supposed to help you fall down less. So little children in Dornoch wear little tourmaline chains, and old ladies. But
Interesting.
yeah, and that's actually one thing. If people don't want to give me money outright, my older friend who makes jewelry wants to sell it and hasn't been able to because of the COVID situation. And so I can send pictures and people can buy jewelry from her.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah,
she
cool.
gives me a little commission. But yeah, that's one thing that desperately needs rescuing.
How could you see that being rescued?
You need more people doing it.
Given this situation of the world, traveling is quite difficult. So do you see that there could be some new way of training people? Do you think, are there enough people to do online training or to even do courses in different parts of the world?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, that would be something that, again, that most of the people who live here are older. I don't know how willing they would be to do that.
Yeah.
If you are in Europe, there are people in Switzerland who are willing to train. There's 3 ladies who are still working, and they are willing to teach. If you've done the basic sort of goldsmithing, like you've got the basics out of the way, and you can even take that in like a hobby course.
Yeah.
If you're in America, it would be something to ask Miles if he would be willing to teach. And maybe he would be willing to do that online, but yeah. But most anthroposophical arts need to be passed directly when you're in the same room with the person.
Yeah.
That might be one that could be different, perhaps. But the thing is about anthroposophical jewelry making, it's one of the few, it's perhaps the only modern jewelry school that still uses the techniques of hammering something into shape that were used in the Baroque era and earlier. So one of my elderly friends was given a Baroque altar to replace pieces that had been lost, and she restored this Baroque altar because only the anthroposophical jewelers still knew how to work in that way. But I think also, yeah, if you can get a visa to be in a school over here, then you can actually travel in, I would think.
Good for people to be aware of these things. And many people, including myself, have never even thought of being a jewelry maker like that as an option. You don't really think about those things. You go through life and then you're like, oh, I could have learned to be a goldsmith or something. You get so put into these like modern day career paths that sometimes you forget that there are other ways you can be and do work. So it's good to kind of just remind people of these things.
And I think the one thing that I'd like to mention on that note is there is a sculpture school here. There are a number of painting schools here.
Yeah.
As a painter, I know people who earn livings doing laser work,
Oh, yeah.
So you could be a painter and paint paintings, but also even paint people's houses. Again, in the English speaking world, you kind of have to build up, but I know people who paint for anthroposophists and non-anthroposophists. These things don't have to be, exclusive to that community.
No, not at all.
But there are lots and lots of schools over here. And that's one thing. It's like, come and study. Yeah, if people want information about the eurythmy school I went to, they can contact me and I'll tell them. There are places where you can go and study something different and have a real craft, and also have a training that means something inwardly.
Very cool.
I mean, there's the peat work, which I think is important. There's a certain number of things that Steiner gave in relation to how to protect us from radiation.
Huh.
And the biodynamic farmers found that they, when Chernobyl was happening, they did some scientific research in Europe. And what they found was that the land was still irradiated in Germany. That cloud,
Yeah.
moved. The land was still irradiated, but if you were doing biodynamic preps, the food was not.
Huh.
So that's an
Interesting.
important thing to know. The peat work is specifically, there are a few people who are doing it over here, but not many, to create things that protect us from, it's possible that also that would be for nuclear radiation, but it's also for things like cell phones.
What do you mean by the peat work?
It's an indication. So Rudolf Steiner almost never gave assignments, which has to do with that thing that I said earlier about sexuality. But in esoteric work, period, you cannot tell people what to do. You have to leave them free.
Yeah, for sure.
And Steiner was very, very, very careful about that. So he would wait for people to come to him with a question about something before he would, even if it was something that was in his head, he never told people what to do.
Yeah.
But the few things that he did, and that there were 2 assignments he gave to everybody, and we'll talk about those later. And then there was this one where he went to this guy and he was like, I want you to work with peat.
Like peat soil.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So the peat, out of peat bogs, and there's a particular thing, I don't know what it's called in English. Scheidiges Wollgras is the German name. There's this particular grass that's mummified in the peat bogs, and it has long fibers. And so you can't make clothing directly out of that, but you can process it in a particular way and then spin it into wool or silk or cotton and then make clothing out of that.
Oh, wow.
This is handmade clothing, or felt it into, felted something with, it's handmade clothing and little pouches for your cell phone and stuff like that are made with peat. And apparently what Steiner said is that the elemental beings are trapped in a peat bog because the what they lived in was mummified, right, by this peat.
Oh, yeah.
And you're so grateful for being released through this process that they will protect you from the radiation.
Oh, that's cool. I like that.
Yeah. And so there's also people, that's why I say the peat work, because it's not just clothing making, that's one aspect, but there you can also make oils or hand creams or things that also are protective.
From the mummified grass in the peat, not the soil itself.
Right.
Ah, okay.
Again, it's a specific thing, and it's something that one would have to learn. And there's a lady that does it in Switzerland, but like there are a few people doing it but it's again something that dying out, so more people need.
Oh, I love that. I want to learn about that. We live on land that has peat soil. It's like yeah. The and the Te Wardle School is on top of it as well, and surrounded by a manuka forest that's peat soil as well. And yeah, I'm like, oh, I wonder if I could dig into my soil and find some of this stuff.
Yeah,
it'd be really interesting.
I can hook you up with someone who could teach you if you'd like.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, even just connecting with somebody, yeah. I mean, but oh, God, I'm doing so many things at the moment, but it's definitely something that I'm interested in. I wonder if anybody's doing it over in New Zealand anyway. Gosh, how do you even choose what to focus on? There are so many interesting things to learn about.
Well, I know my own destiny, but there's also this Steiner thing where he said he had a teacher named Carl Julius Schroer who collected the Christmas plays, the shepherd's play that everyone does. And Schroer had a strong relationship to Goethe and got Steiner his first job. And Steiner's first job was doing Goethe's natural scientific writings, being the editor of those.
Yeah.
But anyway, Schroer was a reincarnation of Plato, I think. And so Schroer was supposed to write the philosophy of spiritual activity that some people call the philosophy of freedom. But anyway, he didn't do it. He didn't fulfill that destiny of writing that book. And so Steiner had to do it.
Good old Steiner.
Steiner, so he did that first because that was the foundation upon which all of his work had to come. And Steiner's work had more to do with the karma lectures and things. It was,
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
as far as I know. It's a bit like that, Amanda. It's like I'm going into the breadth of this thing because there are about 20 to 200 people who should be here, whose destinies haven't led them here, who would be carrying on these things.
Mm.
They're not here. So I'm having to do this oral history project because where is everyone else?
Mm. It's good that you've got that that level of just trust and letting it happen. And like you say, you've got a sense of your destiny. I think that's something that it's good for people to hear that.
Well, destiny is in shambles. So it's it's a mess right now. It's like you don't know if you're ever going to run into your soulmate, and you don't know if you're ever going to run into someone who's going to in your 20s who's going to show you where your life path is, which earlier that would have happened much more easily, but now people actually have to look. And that's where we have to not advertise so much as just put the word out there. This exists. And then people light up to it and go, well, I'm going to make sure that I get over to Switzerland and learn that,
Yeah, for sure. So moving on from the oral history project, unless you had anything else to discuss in terms of the peat thing.
I don't, but there was one more thing that I wanted to briefly mention, which is about grain and bread.
Oh yeah.
And I'll try to make it as brief as I possibly can, but it's important to know that one aspect of biodynamics was that Steiner said we have to develop new plants out of wild plants.
Oh.
So new strawberries out of wild strawberries, new grains out of wild grasses, etc.
Huh.
And there are a few people working on that here. And somebody that people could look up because his story is in English, it's translated, it's online, is Hugo Erbe, E-R-B-E. And it's a lovely to read about him. And he worked with that. And apparently part of it is singing or speaking to the seeds. And Erbe was a bit clairvoyant, and he was also an opera singer.
Oh, that worked out well.
I mention him because this whole question of bread is a real thing right now.
Yeah.
Oh boy, I should probably do a podcast on that. Yeah. Anyway, everyone's gluten intolerant, right?
Yeah, and I am. God, it makes me so ill.
People should be aware that, I don't know, maybe you were always eating organic grain, but
no, I wasn't.
because I think the actual thing is that wheat fields, and this is common practice in non-organic farming, they are sprayed with Roundup.
Yeah.
Because what that tells the plant is, oh my God, I'm going to die. I'm going to make seed right now.
Oh.
It makes the wheat harvest ripen all at the same moment.
Oh.
So every non-organic wheat harvest, unless you're in a country where it's been banned, is sprayed with Roundup. And Roundup is a carcinogenous, nasty poison.
Yeah.
And then they harvest the wheat. So non-organic wheat, I believe, is making reactions in people because they've been eating those chemicals, those poisons. And that creates something like, once you have enough of that in your system, then it's very hard to, I think that's part of it. Also, high gluten wheat has been something that's developed for the past 100 years or so. So specifically to make bread go poof, poof up.
Yeah.
So there are various reasons that people are having to go back to spelt and rye and stuff. Rye is incidentally good because it helps against cancer. So eating rye bread is a good idea anyway. But ideally people would be able to eat wheat too. But then there's this question of, do we have to actually start new and create new grains? And then there's the question of bread. So there's an actual anthroposophical mill. There's a mill developed by a man who was a student of Elizabeth Vrede. Vrede was the head of the mathematical astronomical section and part of the first Vorstand. And she told Volder Wundt that he should look into Eudoxus, who was a Greek philosopher, mathematician. And while he was doing that, he developed this mill. I just want people to be aware that it's a mill where the top stone is angled at the angle of the axis of the earth. This mill apparently, like, you can put grain into it and the flour that comes out is better than the grain you put in. And then there's honey salt bread, which literally anybody could do. If you can get a hold of the recipe, and I should probably try to find it and translate it.
Yeah. Honey
You make
salt.
honey salt bread because Steiner, it actually does rise. It's not a sourdough, but it's somewhat similar. And it's what Steiner recommended for everyone who's baking bread, is to do it in this way.
Do you
Anyway,
use normal wheat? Well, for that?
you can use any kind of grain you want,
Oh, so
with the awareness that rye doesn't rise in the same way. They all have slightly different properties. Yeah.
So it's essentially just, is it like a normal bread recipe, but you add honey and more salt than you usually would?
No, it makes its own. I'm reluctant to compare it to a sourdough starter because it isn't. Sourdough starter is much more living, and like it will grow, and then you have to do something with it every week and stuff. This particular honey salts, it's kind of, you make a kind of a starter, and then you use that to bake your bread with.
Oh, cool.
If you know any old anthroposophists or old German anthroposophists in New Zealand, they might already have that recipe because it is a common thing.
I do. There are a few, there are a few around.
Go ask them.
I will. I will
also,
at the next class lesson. There's a few of them there. So, okay. And for anybody listening, go find a German anthroposophist and ask them. It's your mission. Yeah. Oh, funny. Hey, so we have a third topic here, which we were going to discuss if we've got time. So in talking about the Oral History Project, it can we've been talking about like little specific stories that you've been gathering on your personal mission, but it does kind of raise the question of just history in general. And there's a whole aspect here that I think a lot of people are becoming aware about in terms of the mainstream narrative that we hear with modern day situations or historical situations, all are told through a certain lens. And there's a lot of stuff that often we don't get taught in schools or we miss. And I know that Steiner did talk a bit about what we could call hidden history and how it's important for us these days to kind of be aware of things that may not have been in the light so much in the past. And I thought maybe you would be a good person to touch on this subject.
My destiny has been more in the arts, but I love history, and I've studied 3 areas.
Oh.
I would say at the moment I'm studying anthroposophical history, as in literally the history of the Anthroposophical Society and anthroposophical impulses. And I'm studying that through these conversations and reading books.
Yeah.
There's also the possibility to look at the history of art, which is often intimately tied in with the history of spirituality.
Mm.
And so, certain places you can go to Ravenna and you can see what Christianity looked like before Catholicism. There are a few places where you can go and you can see these heretical streams of Christianity, and you want a good stream of Christianity, you want to look for the heretics, right?
Yeah,
you want to look, and I've done a lot of studying of mystery centers and things like that. So the history of those, where those threads of the right impulses spiritually, where were they happening? I've been to those places. I've looked and tried to read about those things.
Mm.
And then there's, and that's also tied up with understanding the art. And then there's this thing that Steiner said where he gave a couple of assignments to all anthroposophists. And he said, one of them was, you must understand the folk souls. And the other was, you must understand the occult political.
Oh.
And with the folk souls, I've done some thinking about this. I think how I would look at that is every body has a lot of different organs in it. And it has limbs, and it has fingers, and it has a head, and there's all these different bits. The world is like that.
Yeah.
and different parts of this organism are being developed by different peoples. And that history is long and ancient. So you mentioned Lemuria recently.
Oh, yeah.
And like, so we talk about how, all the difficult and spicy issues with white people these days, right?
Yeah.
And but one of the things is like Lemuria, the Eastern Asian peoples and Pacific peoples, it's like they did their job. And it was in a time before recorded history. Like they developed certain things at a time that was pre-Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the Atlantean era, which of 7 epochs, and Lemuria had 7 epochs. And maybe if you were a good enough esoteric student, you could figure out which peoples of Asia did which things in which epochs during that time. And I don't know where Africa or South America falls into this, but I know that, there are certain impulses being developed right now in this time. And I know the next epoch is the Slavic epoch, and the one after that is North America. So that's probably Mexico, the US, and Canada, all of North America. Yeah, so and I don't know, and again, there's then time after that. So maybe the African epochs come later. But anyway, there's always the question of how do you lead? So this particular time, there's certain things that are being developed by the Middle European peoples, and that's the ego peoples. And it's not just Germany, it's this is my own research. I would say it's Belgium, Holland, the Netherlands, that is, Switzerland, Austria, probably the Czech Republic, maybe even Slovakia, Poland, and all of the Norse countries are all part of Middle Europe. They're all developing aspects of the I. Then around that, at the same time in this epoch, is the consciousness soul. And the consciousness soul is being developed by the British. So we all have our tasks at different times. And at the moment, a lot of things the peoples have done their jobs. Like we had the ancient Indian epoch, we had the Egyptians, Assyrian, Chaldean, Babylonian epoch, we had ancient Persia, where they developed agriculture. We had Greece and Rome, and all of these peoples, they did their jobs. And we're currently in an epoch where people are effing things up.
Yeah.
We are, really.
Yeah.
And part of that is, and it's hard to speak about this publicly, but is that the British, not the regular normal people who are absolutely lovely.
Yeah.
But certain peoples want power, and they, I believe, have misunderstood something. My guess is that, and there's a beautiful, in Steiner's mystery dramas, in the 3rd mystery drama, there's a secret brotherhood, and there are scenes where these 2 leaders of the secret brotherhood visit Ahriman's kingdom.
Ooh.
And the leader of and these are good people in this brotherhood. These are very good people. And the leader of this brotherhood says, I always get my truths from here. And for anyone, there should be major alarm bells going off. Like, you're in the wrong place. And his second in command says, this feels funny to me. And it's like, yeah, Ahriman will give you truths, but they aren't the complete truth. So I think my best sense is what happened with England is somebody had some esoteric knowledge. It's like, this is our epoch. God damn it, this is our epoch.
Right.
We're going to knock out those Middle Europeans.
Yeah.
And we're going to take over the world.
Because it's our time and we're the best.
Right. And that epoch started around the time of Shakespeare. Right. That epoch started, or maybe 1419 is like it's around the time that Joan of Arc forced the British out of France. Anyway, so you have Shakespeare, you have this blooming of the German romantics and the German idealism and philosophy. You have all of these incredible things coming out of both of these cultures. And if you take in the Germans' devotion to quality. Like, you can always find organic food, and you can find organic cotton, you can find, all of these things. Even I'm not talking about anthroposophists, I'm talking about regular Germans, and how they want to recycle everything, and they're very conscious about certain things. It's like, this actually is a leading group. They're incredibly tüchtig, is the German word, like they're hardworking. And the British also, like, they're leading ideas happening and coming out of those two cultures. However, there's been a lot of things that were done wrong. And one of them, Steiner says, is the British, actually, their task was not to make a world empire. Their task was to make a world trading organization.
So not to like oppress and exploit people, but to kind of open the world up so that there were channels where everybody could kind of connect with each other.
Well, even they could have ruled an economic empire of some kind by taking their ships from place to place and trading stuff.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have taken over all of India, Australia, or New Zealand. They would have established small trading posts. It's a very different thing than bringing in your armies and oppressing the people. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Wiping them out and such.
Yeah. But they had these boats, and they had, this ability to navigate, and they had, so that was their task. And they have this also ability to be social with different peoples, right? British tea. I mean, tea is supposed to make you social. So this, and they have this hardiness. I mean, you take the British people, there's certain like people I've met that have lived in, like, they've lived in Kenya and they've lived in Australia, and they've, dealt with poisonous snakes and spiders and all kinds of things, and they're just incredibly hardy. They can like take all of it. Certain people that were raised in the British colonies when they were colonies, it's like they were really capable of traveling all over the world and dealing with whatever they met. Anyway, but there's been a misunderstanding, and there's still this sort of, and that's derailed things majorly. So if you decide that rather than being in partnership with Middle Europe, you're going to just push him off the stage, then we get into what Steiner said about the First World War. And what he said was that, and this directly relates back to everything I've just said, the British, there were several reasons that the First World War was started. And if you read any regular history, if you delve into it, they will say it's not really clear who was at fault for that war.
Yeah.
Modern history will tell you that. Regular modern history will tell you that. And Steiner will say the fault was a bit more on the side of the British than the Germans. But it's not like a war where you can say, oh my God, there was a bad guy, because there wasn't. There was just a lot of horrible tragedy.
Yeah.
And so the First World War, the British also wanted to draw the colonies back in. And they wanted to draw New Zealand, Australia, Canada closer again. Because they were, several of those countries, Canada certainly, was in the process of drifting away and becoming more independent.
Right.
So that was an aspect. And another aspect was the German GDP was about to exceed theirs. So what Steiner says several interesting things about history. He says, history happens because people make it happen. And he says history is a convenient fable. He says you have to look behind the scenery of history. Hinter den Kulissen, sagt er. So the history that we're taught in school, I would say, is the first level. And generally, we sort of think, politicians, they bumble into stuff. They're messing up, and we don't realize that if you take that sentence, history happens because people make it happen, then you have to start thinking, these are not all mistakes. Who is benefiting from this event?
Yeah.
And that leads you down a different path. And so you have regular history, and then you have the history, if you delve a little deeper, you'll get there's so much nuance.
Mm.
And then you have like the level of conspiracy theory where you have to be very careful because there's some really odd stuff there and there's some truth, but you have to develop your own sense of truth to sift through and find out what's right. If you're actually gonna go this path and look further.
Mm.
Behind the conspiracy theory is what Steiner's talking about. It's
Oh.
yet another level, the occult political. And behind that, behind Steiner's occult political, are the beings that want certain things.
What beings would they be?
Lucifer and Ahriman, generally.
Aha. Yes. Those two. Would you like to describe those two briefly?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you go into Buddhism, Buddha talks about the middle way. And if you go into Christianity, normal Christianity, you hear a lot about good and evil.
Yeah.
It's this dichotomy. It's like you're either good or you're evil. But actually, Steiner says, no, it's a trinity. There is not this duality, there's threefoldness. So what you want is Lucifer is this being that wants to draw everyone back to being a child of God. No evil, play endlessly in the Garden of Eden, only think spiritual things, don't worry about that physical world.
Yeah, right.
And Ahriman is a being that he's a spiritual being without a physical body at the moment. And he wants people to not believe that he exists because he wants people to believe there is no spiritual world. So he is a being of will and intelligence with no heart. And he wants people to live in this world, in the physical world, and never think that there's anything spiritual. And what you need is something in between. I mean, you need to be living in the middle. And that's what Steiner says is the Christ, is this, that you're a human being. So you're a being with a physical body and a spiritual intelligence, a spiritual individuality. And you want to be living between these two worlds and bringing spiritual ideas into the world in the right way, the right spiritual ideas for that moment.
Yeah. So you need,
And
we do need the two polarities. You can't have.
you want to be marrying the two in the right way.
Yeah, for sure.
And what was helpful to me, because I was a very physical person, I didn't think I had any spiritual perceptions. I know there are other people who are different, but is that if you walk into a room and you say, this feels funny, or if you walk into a place and you're like, this house really has a warmth to it, not a physical warmth, but like, or this feels spooky.
Yeah.
That's already a spiritual perception.
Yeah.
Most people have spiritual perceptions. They just don't realize that's what they are.
That's true.
And so that is a starting place. And I had a eurythmy training too, which is a whole training in the soul. So you then begin to be able to walk into a place and like, okay, I'm going to feel, what does this feel like? Whether I can see gnomes and fairies or angels or whatever, a few people can, more and more people can, again, but I can't. But I can have these soul spiritual feeling perceptions. And the more you listen to them, the more you hear them. It's the same with the more you listen to them, the more obvious, it is.
Yeah. So, continue if you're in the middle of something.
No, go ahead, ask.
I'm just thinking, so in terms of the hidden history aspect, we've got those different layers of history that we are able to penetrate if we choose to. So what do you think in terms of, let's just stay with maybe World War I as an example, because it's just something people are quite familiar with. And so in terms of the Luciferic and Aramaic forces, how were they coming into play with all of that? I mean, in multiple ways, but is there a way that you could kind of describe their actions and what unfolded?
I think I'd like to take this in a slightly different direction.
Yeah, go for it.
Why did Steiner give those two assignments?
So what were the assignments again? Repeat those.
Understand the folk souls and understand the occult.
Yep. Yeah.
Steiner was clairvoyant, and I'm pretty certain from certain things that he did that he knew what was coming. He could see the Nazi thing. He specifically said in 1917, the worst evil mankind has ever known is coming into being right now in Russia. And that was the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist revolution.
Yeah, right.
And I think what he was saying to his followers, and his followers were mostly not awake enough to get what he was saying and actually follow up on it. Some people did, but not many. Is he was saying, folks, wake up, we need to act now. He knew that the First World War and the way that it was manipulated, that war, would lead into the Russian Revolution and the Second World War and all of these horribly evil things that have happened in that century. And he was saying, so in other countries in the world, like in America, I'm not sure how much we even run into people with other folk souls. New Zealand may be similar. It's like you're not that close to it. But in Europe, where you have the German people right next to the French, right next to, the Danish, you have, the Polish, you have peoples that are totally different with totally different priorities.
Yeah.
You're right next to each other, and your natural impulse is to think that you're better. In the word chauvinism, we use chauvinism for male chauvinism, but what it actually means is my country, my way of being is better than yours.
Yeah.
So if people had been awake to the folk souls and awake to the positive aspects of the other folk souls, that war maybe could have been prevented.
Yeah. Because just because there are different folk souls, it's probably good to kind of emphasize, doesn't mean that any folk soul is any more important or any more special than any other one. Just like you need lungs and a brain to be, within the body. Yeah.
And it's also important to note that they're not conflated with, it's not the same thing as race.
Yes. Yeah.
Like if a person is, it's tied to where you are born.
Right. Yeah, true. Tied to where you were born.
Tied to the forces that are coming out of the earth and the forces that are coming out of the cosmos in that particular spot.
Yeah. So it's not, in New Zealand, you could have had grandparents could have immigrated from China. You were born in New Zealand. You're kind of like blanketed by the same folk soul that a Māori or a Pacifica person or a Pākehā person has, being born here.
You are a Kiwi if you're born there.
Yeah.
There are some questions I have about that, which probably don't belong in this conversation, but such as, are there slight variances? Like in America, I would wonder, and I would have to really have a deep conversation with a Native American person are there aspects of the folk soul that are more developed by the Native American, more developed by the white person born in America, and more developed by the Black person or Chinese person, person of that heritage that's born in America? Are we developing different aspects of the same thing, or is it really all exactly the same folk soul?
Yeah. And then you also have a question of like, I've just thought of it of like borders, because borders change all the time, or the European borders have changed throughout history. So when did the folk soul be like, I will be defined to this border? I wonder if folk souls kind of like evolve and new ones spring up, or they change into different ones when different borders pop up.
It is a brilliant question that I have never studied, so I can't give you an answer. I can tell you two anecdotal things.
Yeah.
That aren't direct answers. One is that the French are now the intellectual soul. That's where the intellectual soul lives now. but the peoples that developed it were the Greek and the Romans. The Greek folk soul moved to France.
Huh.
So the ancient Greeks loved beauty. They wanted everything to be aesthetic. Does this remind you of anybody?
Yeah.
The French love beauty. They want everything to be aesthetic. They're very, very intellectually capable, philosophically capable. It's like that folk soul moved. I don't know when exactly it moved, but it did. And apparently Odin, the ancient god from the Norse, apparently he made a decision to move and become the folk soul of Armenia.
Huh.
So these things are complex, and I don't want to get into that right now because we're trying to follow a different thread. But yes, things shift and change, and
I think it's probably good to say that people, it's every person has to kind of explore this in their own way.
Yeah.
There's no clear black and white answers about this. Where were we? Back to
we were trying to get into why did Steiner give those assignments?
Yeah.
So the depths of really depravity and evil that you can see in that started to happen in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and in the Nazi thing in Germany, and then happened also in China under Mao. 70 million deaths under Mao, 40 million under Stalin. We say 11 million under Hitler. We talk about Hitler a lot, but we don't talk about those other things. Those are numbers from Solzhenitsyn and from a woman named Jung Chang, who wrote a biography of Mao. Solzhenitsyn estimated 110 million people died under the Bolshevik regime, the 70 years in Russia, 40 million under Stalin himself. And so those things, Steiner wanted to stop that before it started. And he wanted anthroposophists to be awake enough to do that. And they weren't. He actually said at one point, if there had been 12 real anthroposophists in Russia, they could have stopped the Russian Revolution when it started. And there is an example of someone who did do his task, and that man is named Alexander Trapeznikov. And he was, I don't remember if he was in Moscow or St. Petersburg, but he was an anthroposophist, and he did enter into negotiations with Lenin's either wife, mother, or sister. I can't remember which female relative it was, or maybe two of them. And he managed to save the Russian museums. So we have the Hermitage because of an anthroposophist. He was awake, and he managed to negotiate that the art should be protected.
Yeah. And
so Russia still has its art, and that's world heritage. I mean, things in the Hermitage, there's Raphael paintings and, amazing things. And to a certain degree, then churches and monasteries would have been protected because of their artistic, not the religious aspects, but the artistic things would have been protected. And that maybe doesn't sound extraordinary until you remember the Chinese Cultural Revolution, where they went and they destroyed their own heritage, and they destroyed anything Western. Like if you saw the movie The Red Violin 20 years ago, the burning of Stradivarius violins, and like anything artistic was destroyed. That's a huge loss for the folk soul of that country.
Yeah.
It's a loss for the souls of the individual people, because being surrounded by beauty is important.
For sure.
Anyway, so that's a success. That was a success. And that's something that I like to do, is because it's so dark, the history is so dark, is to look for these moments of where did someone actually do it right. There's actually another book that I want to publish, which is a Christian community priest who was alive in the First and Second World Wars in Germany, and he writes those kind of stories about people that have these spiritual experiences even in the darkest of times.
Yeah.
And I think that's important it's translated. I can't find a publisher, but it's important to get that into English so that people have this counterpoint of like, no, we actually can do this right. Even if things become very dark around us, we can do it right.
Yeah.
And I think they don't want to look at the darkness because it's too dark. And it would be too sad to think that people were doing those sorts of things intentionally. And so we don't want to see that.
No.
And there's two things to say on that subject. One is that, so those regimes can be tied to Luciferic and Ahrimanic groups. Steiner talked about the Brothers of the Left. He gave some lectures on secret brotherhoods, and he said most people in the Masons, or most people in spiritual streams, they're there to work on themselves.
Yeah.
They're to work on their own spiritual development.
Yeah.
And that's great. He says once you cross the line between good occult and bad occult, and Christian groups will often say, oh, occult, we throw that all in, one bag and it's all bad.
Yeah.
No, as a Christian, you're actually working with occult things. You're working with spiritual things yourself.
Yeah.
And the word occult's a secret. The line between good and bad is whether you are starting to use your secret knowledge to manipulate other people or for your own gain. So when secret brotherhoods start to use their knowledge and their connections to manipulate politics, that is when you're treading into the realm of the bad occult. And Steiner called those particular people who were doing that within the Masons the Brothers of the Left. And you can, and he also had a lot of strong things to say about the Jesuits, which made him some enemies. Not Catholics in general, but the Jesuits.
Right. Yeah.
Who, any person can read that history of how did the Jesuits manipulate politics? How did the Jesuits come in and, it's a very strong will training, and they would come in and they would really control these indigenous populations in California or wherever they were. Again, Ignatius of Loyola himself, Steiner said, was not a bad person. So, it's complex, and there are probably good people in the Jesuits too. And, it's never black and white.
No.
But he said basically the Lucifer works through the Jesuits coming out of Rome. Ahriman works through the Freemasons coming out of London.
Ah, right. Interesting.
And so the Nazi thing, there is a relationship to the Luciferic thing with the Jesuits. And the Freemasons, there is a relationship to other things. And so certain very dark regimes that have existed, and even into today, I mean, this is still happening. It's not gone. And I think the main important thing that one needs to do as an anthroposophist or a human being is, at least in America, we tend to get very caught up in right left. Like, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Are you, the Democrats, then they're all good people and we're fighting for the little guy and we're, compassionate, and the Republicans are bad, or, vice versa, and it's like, that's a puppet play. That's a marionette play.
Yeah.
Because that's left and right. That's two sides. That's a duality. What you as a human being need to do is find middle. So you need to be able to look at those things and see what the play is and what the play is trying to manipulate you to do.
Yeah.
And what tends to happen is propaganda exists. It existed in those societies. It exists now.
Oh, yeah. No one can deny that propaganda exists. I mean, even in advertising and TV shows, there's underlying agendas for all kinds of stuff. I think people know that, but to what extent, how deep or how intense they think it is depends on a lot of things. But yes, propaganda does exist for sure.
How much do you know about Hegelian dialectic?
Explain it to me.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So you have two sides and you come to a synthesis together.
Oh, right.
And
yeah.
this is tied to Lucifer and Ahriman, thesis, antithesis, and Christ is the synthesis
Yeah, right.
of the two.
Yeah.
And there's apparently a quote by Steiner, and I did not get a hold of it somebody told it to me, that Hegelian dialectic would be used for bad occult purposes in America. And I think it's actually in general in the world. So what happens is we have right-wing things like the Nazi Reich in Germany, and we have left-wing things like communist governments.
Yeah.
And people run between the two. So we've had in America, it forced down our throat. Every movie you see that has a bad guy, it's a Nazi, it's a German. We've had that for a very long time. We've seen much more about how bad the Nazis are than how bad the KGB was. And so people they've been forced into the idea that the right wing is horrible.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's not.
Yeah.
That phenomenon was not horrible. I'm saying that means that now they are going to run to the other polarity. And what I'm seeing with a lot of young people is capitalism is bad. Bring back communism. We can't afford to pay our rents, which is again a phenomenon we talked about at the very beginning with this speculative housing market. We're not being paid enough. We can't afford to pay our rents. Bring in communism so that we don't have to work all the time. You are running from one pole to the other pole. You don't want to do that. You want to stop in the middle. And I would like to encourage anybody who is running in the direction of communism to please go and read the book Wild Swans by Jung Chang. Go read the book Mao by Jung Chang. Go read any of Solzhenitsyn's work, The Gulag Archipelago. You want to understand what that was. It was not a good thing. And we all say, oh, it's never been implemented correctly. No, it just wasn't a good thing.
Yeah.
What we want is to stop in the middle.
Yeah.
And the middle is Steiner's threefold social order.
Yeah.
And just as one example, for instance, Steiner said that when you mechanize a factory and you need half as many people because you now have machines doing the work, mechanization needs to happen hand in hand with brotherhood. So that when you mechanize a factory, you would keep all of your workers, pay them the same wage that they had before, and have them work for 4 hours a day.
Rather than 8.
Right. So what you're doing is you're making that machine thing serve everyone. So what we've got right now is CEOs becoming really wealthy, everyone else becoming way poorer. There are fewer and fewer jobs. No, what you needed to do was make that be a benefit to everyone.
Yeah, right.
So then you have say they were making 40,000 a year before, they're still making 40,000 a year. They can still pay their bills. They're only working 4 hours a day. They have 4 more hours to be with their kids.
Yeah.
Or learn how to play the violin. Or do something artistic.
Or contribute to their community.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what people really want, is that.
Yeah.
And that's called social order. That's not what communism was or will be.
No.
Anyway, sorry, I know I could make enemies saying that, but I've read those books and I feel like people need to look at the numbers and understand what those societies were.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not run in that direction, not run from one side to the other. And then, in 50 years, if everything turns communist, people will be running back into the arms of the Third Reich. And you don't want to do that either.
No. It's this shining goal of true freedom that we really need to keep in mind. And with both of those, right and left, you lose your freedom in different ways. It's a different, and there's that middle ground where true freedom can be achieved. And you just kind of, the way that you described the mechanization of factories affecting the workers and benefiting everyone is just such a it kind of answers the question of, you know, that universal basic income, but in a truer, more sustainable sense. You
Yeah.
know, people are still working, they're still part of something. And in fact, if you're going to work for 4 hours a day and a lot of your job has been replaced by the machine, think of all the innovation that could be happening then, you know,
Yeah.
during that time, plus all the amazing art that could be created, which, I mean, you and I could, that would be a whole other podcast about the fundamental importance of art. And it's not that nobody's working, and it's not that there's no routine, and it's not dictated to them by some like automated system, or we're all living in poverty because there are just machines working in the factories and we have nothing. I don't know, I think a lot of people would hear you talking about that example and go, that's it.
Yeah.
And factory owners can still make money. If you've created something, you can still get resources back for it and be compensated for it. Do you know what I mean? Everybody wins if we did it that way.
Yeah.
Mm.
There's another lovely little story that I'd like to tell about the threefold social order. One of my teachers was, let's see, she comes from an Austrian Jewish family, and her grandparents. So Wanda, my teacher, was born in 1939 in Poland to a Polish man and an Austrian Jewish mother, and they were both anthroposophists. And the grandparents were not anthroposophists, so they were Jewish heritage, and they owned a book binding or printing factory. And all three of their children became anthroposophists. two daughters and a son. And there's whole stories about how these people survived, how the children survived. But one daughter managed to get out of Europe on one of the last boats, and the son managed to get to England. But the son had told them in the 30s, and again, oh boy, that's a long story. But you know, the foundation for Hitler being able to come to power in Germany in the 30s was that people could not feed their families.
Yeah.
And they could not feed the families because there was a world economic depression that we were all dealing with.
Yeah.
And Germany was paying the war debt. And they've continued to pay that war debt until about 20 years ago. I don't know if everyone knows that. Or the First World War. It had been decided that they were responsible and they were paying the war debt. So people were losing their houses, they couldn't feed their families. Hitler was a way that they could do that, and they didn't see all the other dark aspects. They just wanted to be able to have food on the table. Is one aspect of how he came to power. But anyway, so there's this horrible situation, and this son says to his parents, you have to bring in the threefold social order in your factory. And so in Austria, sometime in the late 20s or early 30s, they did that. These people who weren't even anthroposophists, they did that. And so their factory workers were able to save money in a time of ridiculous inflation. Everyone can read about that, you know, wheelbarrows of notes to buy a loaf of bread and stuff.
Yeah.
And their factory workers were able to keep their houses and feed their families and save money. Because of how they ran their factory and because of them doing this anthroposophical form. And when the Nazis came, the factory workers took these two old people and they hid them and they fed them for the entire war.
No.
So Wanda's grandparents survived because they had done the right thing by their workers.
Yeah. They were a community. They were, like you said, a brotherhood.
So this, like, that people who have money, or that they would, you know, that the Emil Molt story where he started this Waldorf school for his factory workers' children. And what I didn't realize was his factory workers, the people making the cigarettes, they were mostly women.
Yeah, I've recently learned that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So of course they wanted a good place for their children to go.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
these
for sure.
deeds where you have money and you are making a good living, and then you decide that 1% goes to the arts.
Mm.
I mean, that's nothing. Or that, 5% goes to, making the school, or whatever. You've created something incredible in the world,
Yeah.
and people are grateful.
And then it means
Yeah.
that people don't have to rely so much on centralized government. They can be a lot more focused and specific to community initiatives, which I feel like is a way people might be needing to move forward anyway. Governments don't have as much, don't have all the money to quote unquote bail people out or help fund specific initiatives for different communities, because every community needs something slightly different. And the same for like workers of a certain institution, they might need something specific. And if they can all work together in ways that you're talking about, they can create what their children and what the people need. Because somebody sitting, some MP in Parliament doesn't necessarily know what a certain community in a small rural village needs. I think that's like one of the points of the threefold, that social order, isn't it? Is that like different spheres?
The right sphere, the economic sphere, and the spiritual cultural sphere.
That's the one.
And their mottos are liberty in the right sphere, everyone. No, that's wrong. Equality under the law. Everyone is equal under the law.
Mm-hmm.
Brotherhood in the economic.
Uh-huh.
We think about, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to make money, but actually, if you're going to make anything, you need your contact who's going to make this part for you, or you need somebody to, we all need each other in the economic sphere. Definitely. And then the spiritual cultural sphere, where is liberty, freedom, everything should be free. That education would not be indoctrination. That everything in the spiritual cultural sphere, the arts and education and all of that, would be freedom, would be the sign there.
Yeah, well, that sounds good. Let's go do that. Let's do it. We figured it out. Well, it got figured out 100 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. We're just trying to catch up.
Yeah. Before we say goodbye, is there anything else that you wanted to say?
I feel like if people want to contact me to know more about hidden history, they can. If that's an interest, they can.
Yeah.
And I have certain books that I've read that have been helpful. But I also feel like, when I was thinking about this and preparing, that if you're going to address that, it is, when you do that initial research, it's dark. It's very hard to digest. And so I think that actually needs to go hand in hand with either reading Knowledge of Higher Worlds or doing the basic exercises. The basic exercises of like learning willed thinking, learning how to think through things, because many things are shadowed and it's hard to figure out the truth behind them. But also, there's will, there's equanimity, because you take something like that on, you need to be in equanimity. There's open-mindedness and there's positivity. So all of those things, it's like you need those when you're dealing with these issues. And I think that's why many anthroposophists do not go into that. They either haven't heard that Steiner recommended it, or it's just like, no, that's way too dark. And so those exercises probably help,
Yeah. They help for, even if you didn't want to go into the stuff.
Super important.
Yeah, very important. Yeah. Go, continue.
Sorry, one last thing. The thinking exercise has been, I think, one of my basic building blocks of like, we're lazy on our thinking. And Steiner actually said that was partly because of bad food.
Oh yeah.
So he said biodynamic agriculture is there because it gives you more fuel to think better. And but also, that we flex that you learn to Yeah, to take some simple object and think about it. I had my anthroposophy teacher said he could think about pencil and make new thoughts about it for 20 minutes a day.
20 minutes? Ooh.
Yeah, I am not anywhere near that level, but I have learned to, when something comes at me, like the corona situation or anything where it's like you take it and you form thoughts about it, but you also leave yourself open. You don't judge. You let new information come at you, and you allow things gradually to build a picture in yourself. And that's, it's helpful to have a background in the occult history thing, but then when a new phenomenon comes at you, you can allow different pieces. Steiner said, we can never get to the whole truth in this lifetime, but we should always be striving to get there.
Yeah.
And so allowing a picture to build itself in you, it's like a new piece of information comes, like, oh, well, that belongs. And gradually you get a sense of what's happening. Rather than making a snap judgment, I'm on this side, I'm on that side. It's like, no, let's build a picture. Maybe there are aspects of truth on both sides.
Yeah. So would you recommend people, because I know there are a few books around that cover those 6 exercises and a few of his other exercises he mentions. If people are just starting, would you recommend they read How to Know Higher Worlds for those exercises, or there's a few of them? What would you recommend?
The 6 basic exercises are in guidance and esoteric training.
Oh, yeah.
And they may be someplace else as well. Steiner gave lots of sets of exercises. There's Knowledge of Higher Worlds is a beautiful path. It's actually the one book he said, don't study it in a group.
Oh, did he? Interesting.
And it's a beautiful path, though, to something to keep reading yourself and going, okay, well, now it's going to take me 5 years to develop reverence. It's like,
yeah.
all of these things that, it's another path. I mean, there are lots of different ones. I've just come across a stash of the virtues, which are meditations by Herbert Witzenmann on virtues that Steiner gave for each month of the zodiac, actually, which would be a lovely thing to have, because it's not so hectic as basic exercises or the calendar of the soul every week or the Eightfold Path, which is one for every day. It's a whole month that you're developing a thing, yeah. People can contact me to find out how to buy that as well, because I thought it was out of print and it's virtually impossible to find on the internet, but I now know that there are some.
Is it in English?
In English, yeah.
Oh, cool. So I think with all this kind of stuff, if once you start looking and you know the right people and places to connect with this information, it all kind of just appears to you in the right time. Books that kind of appear on library shelves or will come up on an Instagram post or something. You kind of have to trust that the right thing will come to you at the right time, But
I'm also available if people are looking for something. I have kind of a lot of knowledge about finding stuff.
Yeah, you are very good. So it's probably a good time to mention where people can find you. Where do we find you? Wandering around the Goetheanum?
Sometimes. I mean, yeah, just my online presence. I can be contacted over that. Instagram at Anthroposophical Impulses. I'm under Anthroposophical Impulses on Patreon.
That's all good. We can put the Patreon and the Instagram name in the show notes, and people will be able to find you and ask you all the questions and become patrons of your the Oral History Project. Thank you so much for taking the time to share all of this information with us today, Rima. I've really enjoyed listening to you speak. Not only do you have nice and interesting things to say, but you have a really nice voice to listen to. So It makes for a good podcast, you know?
Great.
I'm going to say good night, and you'll say good morning, I guess, being in on the other side of the world. I hope you have a good day.
And I hope you have a good night.
Yeah, I will.